Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by...
Hi, I'm Travis Waldron, the sports reporter at the Huffington Post.
Thanks for coming on with me, Travis. We just finished NFL Week 5, and in my anecdotal experience, I think I saw fewer advertisements for DraftKings and FanDuel, which are these, they're called daily fantasy sports competitions, websites, whatever you want to call it. And they've kind of exploded in at least marketing and advertising prominence this year. And I wanted to have you on because you've had a couple stories on their prominence and a couple scandals that have engulfed the quote-unquote daily fantasy industry. But first, could you kind of walk me through, and for our viewers at home, what exactly is daily fantasy and why has it gotten so popular now?
Sure. So first off, I'm glad you saw fewer ads. I was actually walking to the store yesterday in between NFL games and saw a DC Metro bus with a FanDuel ad on the side of it. So I can't
Right.
say the same. In terms of what daily fantasy sports are, they're essentially a hyperactive version of traditional fantasy sports. You, instead of picking a lineup at the beginning of the season with a small group of your friends and then using that lineup or some small variant of it throughout the entire season, you're choosing a new lineup every week. And the major difference is that it's every week in terms of the NFL. If you're talking baseball or basketball, you can choose a different lineup every day. And the major difference is that you can choose the same players as everyone else. So you're all choosing from the same player pool. Everyone has access to, say, Julio Jones. So if I choose Julio Jones, that doesn't mean you can't. And so it kind of changes the equation of how you win or how you make money off of this, because now you're having to choose a lineup that kind of varies and wins on the margins. You have to pick the right players and also try to find some players that aren't being used as frequently as others that are going to have a good week, which that point specifically will matter a little later in this discussion.
Sure. And to my experience, and I don't play daily fantasy sports, but the big two are, like I mentioned earlier, FanDuel and DraftKings. But to me, an outsider who has been playing traditional fantasy sports for, 10 years now, the difference to me is I go to try and play on FanDuel or DraftKings, and the first thing that happens is they want my credit card information. Whereas if I go to ESPN or Yahoo or one of the traditional fantasy sports websites that runs these things, it's all for free. And I don't know if there is a place where you can play quote unquote daily fantasy sports with no money involved. But it seems to me that that is a much more important part of the equation than traditional fantasy sports. I mean, traditional fantasy sports originated, if you'll pardon the cliche, with nerds in their basements, working out statistics by hand on with a pen and paper or pencil and paper. And the online versions of those are basically just sophisticated versions of working out statistics by hand and figuring out who wins. But it seems to me that daily fantasy, because there's a mandatory, or in at least my experience, there's a mandatory buy-in for it. Obviously, the websites take a cut of it. That's how they make their money. That kind of changes the function, or at least the spirit. I don't know. Maybe I'm off base here in saying that they seem, functionally different to me. It seems to change it at a fundamental level from, just working out statistics with a group of your friends to putting money down on players to win every week.
Right, and that's, until the last couple of weeks, that has been the major question about daily fantasy sports, is that you didn't use the word, but the question has been, do they constitute gambling? The fantasy sports, as we know them, traditional fantasy sports, were protected under federal law. In 2006, Congress passed a law that outlawed online gambling, mostly targeted at online poker, but also at online sports gambling. And the NFL and other leagues that had an interest in maintaining fantasy sports, traditional fantasy sports, got a carve out in that law to protect those versions of the games. So no one's ever really thought of fantasy as gambling. It kind of feels more like a March Madness pool, right? Like you get together with 10 of your friends, 11 of your friends, and you maybe throw $20 or $50 or whatever it is down, but it doesn't feel like large scale gambling. Daily fantasy kind of blurs that line a little bit more, and so there have been a lot of questions of, is it gambling? And the industry says that same carve out that protects, your ESPN fantasy league also protects DraftKings, FanDuel, and daily fantasy. There are a lot of people who aren't so sure though, because again, like you said, the house takes a cut. You're putting money down and you're wagering it essentially on getting money back based on the performance of players. Now they say the reason daily fantasy would not be considered gambling is because that federal law has a protection for games of skill. Is what they're called, and they argue that this is a game of skill, that you have to know the lineups, you have to know which players are going to play well and which players have good matchups and whatnot. That question hasn't really been settled one way or the other because there haven't been any major court cases or anything that have called that law into question with regards to the type of contests that go on DraftKings or FanDuel. So it's a really kind of iffy atmosphere right now, and it's one that is only been driven further probably into the murkiness of that legal situation by the leagues like the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball and a lot of their teams getting really closely involved with it because they all have these sponsorship deals now. And like I said, until the last week or so, that was the major question around the industry. And now because of these new allegations, there's so many more questions.
So just to clear something up for me, and I don't know if you have the answer to this, in that carve-out, the 2006 carve-out for fantasy sports, would that, if they didn't have that carve-out, would that have rendered functionally illegal what ESPN has, which, you go there and it's just, it looks like a free game to play. It's not, there doesn't seem to be any money changing hands officially, at least, on ESPN's, traditional fantasy tool application, whatever you want to call it. And it seems like if there is no money involved, that wouldn't constitute online gaming. But I don't know, maybe, do you have the answer to this? If they didn't have that carve out, would ESPN have, I guess in 2006, shut down its fantasy tool because, I don't know, maybe it's enabling gambling? Because, I know none of the leagues that I play in, there's no buy-in.
Right.
Maybe I'm admitting to a crime here. But it's like playing poker in your buddy's basement where everybody plays for $10, $20, whatever, to me. And I don't know, would ESPN have been forced to shut down their fantasy tool if they didn't have this carve out in 2006? And this is just to the best of my knowledge, in 2006, did daily fantasy even exist? Was there a need for it to have a carve out?
I don't know the answer specifically to whether ESPN would have had to shut down their fantasy football client or if any of the others would have at the time. I know it would have probably created a lot more questions about it in terms of should they be enabling it or anything like that. If I remember right, I've been playing fantasy football and fantasy baseball since I was in high school. And back when it first started, if I remember right, you couldn't really pay each other through these clients, and I think you can on some of them now. So I don't know what in terms of what
right.
if that carve out wouldn't have existed, would fantasy as we know it have shut down? I don't know. I know the NFL and the leagues were probably worried about that and worked specifically to carve it out for exactly that reason. And as you mentioned, daily fantasy as it exists now in the mode of DraftKings and FanDuel is virtually non-existent, if not non-existent altogether at that point. It started up in a small way, I think, not long after that, but it's only really been in the last 2 to 3 years that daily fantasy has gone mainstream. And again, a lot of that is because the leagues themselves and their teams have partnered with these with FanDuel and DraftKings primarily, and also ESPN and CBS and Sports Illustrated and all these other places have also partnered with them and also have sponsorship deals and things like that have really driven the growth of this. And I think it's sort of a natural outgrowth, right? Because fantasy sports is so popular that why not do it every week instead of drafting one lineup at the beginning of the year and then say, like yesterday, if you lose Jamal Charles in your fantasy lineup, well, now your whole season might be wrecked 5 weeks in, and you have to wait until next fall to revamp that. But if you're doing it every week, well, you lost Jamal Charles this week, but next week you're starting with a clean slate. So I think it's a natural outgrowth, but it's also one that, given the way it's grown, has invited a lot of scrutiny. And like so many things in Congress, wasn't clearly spelled out by that 2006 law, in large part because I don't know that they anticipated this sort of thing. And it's worth noting too, when it comes to that law, the fantasy carve out was tacked on essentially at the last minute. So it wasn't something that was hotly debated or well thought out at the time, the way I understand it.
Right. And what actually kind of opened my eyes to, I guess, what daily fantasy kind of is right now, was a Bloomberg Businessweek article a couple weeks ago about, the business of FanDuel and DraftKings and how they got so big, and they've gotten huge cash infusions from outside companies investing in them, basically. But last year, I remember, for example, I was watching football at a bar with a friend of mine who is in a fantasy league with me, and I asked him, after a FanDuel or DraftKings ad was on, hey, have you ever played in these leagues? And he's like, yeah, I'll play. I throw down a couple bucks. I basically break even over the course of the season. It's pretty fun. I like it. And then this Bloomberg Businessweek article a couple weeks ago kind of exposed, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, and there have been further investigations, what daily fantasy is. And basically because of that 2006 law that you mentioned, a lot of the big-time online poker sharks migrated from online poker, which got outlawed then, into daily fantasy, where if you have the power, if you have the tools, if you have the statistical prowess, and if you have the money to invest in daily fantasy, you can throw tons and tons of money into it, play, hundreds, maybe thousands of games a week, and with all of that investment, you can make a lot of money. And in that article, and I know there was a New York Times follow-up, something like 1% of fantasy players make, 90% of the winnings, or daily fantasy players make like 90% of the winnings, because there are these sharks who, they use statistical tools. They have these auto script programs that set their lineups for them. And they're just basically trying to take money from noobs like my friend who's putting down $5-10 a week, just hoping to have a little fun. So to me, it seems like because of that carve out, we've seen that migration of big time online, basically professional gamblers coming into the daily fantasy space and making that into something that is kind of, to me, pretty indistinguishable from gambling. Though in that Bloomberg Businessweek article, again, I think it was their CEO said, this is a hard game. It's not for the lighthearted, blah, blah, blah. But those words are carefully chosen because the fantasy carve-out, like you said, specifically is for games of skill. So the PR and marketers of FanDuel and DraftKings have this huge incentive to say this is a very difficult game to play because they have to portray it as a skill game, not a luck-based game, in order to keep it legal.
Right. That game of skill distinction is a huge thing. But I think you're probably right in terms of the online poker migration. In terms of that's how you're doing it. You're not rolling in here into these things and playing one lineup a week for $10 or $15 and winning big money. I mean, you might win few $100 playing that way. You might win a little more than that, but it's going to take an extreme amount of kind of luck to do that. If you're actually trying to do this for money, though, from my understanding of it, and I haven't played these games very much. I played this weekend in an effort to try and better understand it, and did not win any money. But I think if you're actually trying to return a good sized chunk of change in these games, it's like Bloomberg and others have now laid out. You've got to put down a significant amount of money up front. You've got to play a large number or a fairly large number of lineups, and you have to kind of optimize it. And I think it's really interesting when you read that Bloomberg article or other articles about this, and you talk about these guys who have their own computer algorithms set up to help them optimize lineups. It's that's something that the average person playing isn't going to do, and probably doesn't have the skill to do. So, I think they do like to service that argument that it's a game of skill on that front. But I think that also raises a number of questions back to it as well about, what kind of odds do you have on this? What kind of transparency needs to be in place to tell people, what their chances of winning are, how many people are playing the game that way. It's something that it's kind of funny that I think this industry in a lot of ways has grown much faster than the understanding of it even has. There are people who understand how to play these games, and there are a lot of people who are just diving in because they see the commercials and they think, well, hell, that sounds fun. And so they do it. And I think, even when you talk about the members of Congress that have started raising questions about it, when you talk about how it fits into the fantasy landscape and the carve out under the law, all of these things, like no one really has the answers yet. And so we're kind of learning on the fly in a lot of ways when it comes to how DraftKings and FanDuel operate, what the best way to play them and whatnot. But it's, I think I think that Bloomberg piece is highly illustrative of a lot of things that are present here in terms of how much you have, how good of a chance you have to win. And, if you're putting down $10, you probably aren't going to walk away as one of the ones carrying the big $1 million check like you see in the commercials.
Yeah, and speaking of that, not huge, and the industry growing kind of on the fly, like you said, a scandal erupted early last week, when it was revealed that I don't remember which company, one of the companies, a FanDuel employee, a DraftKings employee, was the number one money winner on FanDuel, and further investigations have revealed that while for the most part these companies prohibit their employees from playing in games on their own sites, they're perfectly free to play daily fantasy on other sites. And with all of this kind of insider information, if you look at who's winning these massive amounts of money, it's by and large employees or not by and large, but disproportionately highly employees of the sites themselves. So they've been left scrambling. And I think, and this is again just anecdotal, maybe that's one of the reasons that I saw fewer commercials for these sites over the weekend. ESPN modified their weird agreement marketing contract with DraftKings. What do you make of that revelation, I suppose, and maybe this increased consciousness as to who's actually playing these games and who's winning money on them?
It's huge. It's a huge revelation. It was a huge deal. It's hard to know the specifics of this situation in terms of did the DraftKings employee use the information that he had to win the $350,000 that he won the same weekend. The basics of it are that a DraftKings employee leaked out information on the prevalence of certain NFL players in lineups, which, as I mentioned earlier, exploiting those margins and finding underrepresented, undervalued players who then exceed their expectations is a really good way to win in these games. There's no evidence so far that we've seen, and DraftKings maintains that the employee didn't use the information improperly. even if that's the case, though, a lot of the people that I've talked to about this have said, it's indicative of the fact that there could be problems. And it raises questions about the internal controls at these companies to keep that information confidential as it's supposed to, and to keep their employees from using it to gain an advantage, or to keep them from, passing it along to people to gain an advantage. And there's a consumer protection aspect to that. There's fraud and negligence, and other aspects about that is now class action lawsuits have raised. But I think it's only the beginning in terms of figuring out, what they're going to do in response to this. ESPN and Major League Baseball, you mentioned ESPN, but also Major League Baseball, they've raised concerns about this scandal. The two companies have taken their own steps. DraftKings and FanDuel have both banned their employees from playing daily fantasy on rival sites. They've also hired, I get them mixed up, but one of them hired a former U.S. Attorney General, the other hired a former U.S. prosecutor or U.S. attorney to kind of investigate their best practices, monitor their internal controls, recommend what they could do better. So they're taking it very seriously, and it is both from a perception standpoint and from a potential action standpoint, is a big scandal, because now you already had this atmosphere of Congress and the states questioning the legality of daily fantasy under gambling laws. Well, now you have another reason for lawmakers and attorneys general and everyone else to kind of take a look at this industry and see, is this the type of thing that we want to keep growing this fast? Is this something that needs federal or state level regulation? Is it something that needs more scrutiny that leads to better self-regulation? It has raised a ton of questions about the growth of the industry, even more than already existed.
Right. And I think, at least for me, a lot of this has kind of highlighted the absurdity of that fantasy sports carve-out. Either, if you want to say, the differentiation between games of luck and games of skill, and the legality of putting money on that, or to claim that fantasy sports or daily fantasy is a game of skill, any more so than, say, online poker, competing against other players from around the country or world or whatever. So it seems to have put an absurdity and made a lie of that distinction. Whether that means Congress goes back and relaxes the rules on online poker and online gambling generally, or they come back and take a look at daily fantasy and its legality, seems like a logical step for them to take. Whether they go back in one direction or the other, I don't know. I tend to believe they want to side on the overregulation of as opposed to underregulation, and they would likely want to classify daily fantasy in the same category as online poker. But what's your take on this? I know you've written about how Congress is going to be revisiting this, and who, I guess, the major players would be in Congress taking a look at this.
So the big players right now are from states that either have gambling or want gambling. Chiefly New Jersey, which is involved in a federal case against the leagues and against everyone else, who challenging another federal law that prohibits sports gambling, except in the states where it already existed. So like Nevada and others. But New Jersey wants legal sports gambling in the state, in Atlantic City and elsewhere. And so Frank Pallone, a congressman from New Jersey, had already sought to hold a hearing on daily fantasy in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee that has jurisdiction over gambling and professional sports, incidentally. If they were already planning, he was already asking for that hearing, and now with this scandal, he renewed that call, and it seems pretty likely, in my estimation, that hearing will take place at some point. Fred Upton, the chairman of that committee, had already sort of indicated a willingness to wanting to do it, and now, I would be surprised at this point if that hearing doesn't take place eventually, probably before the end of the year. Harry Reid has also spoken out on this. Obviously, the Las Vegas and Nevada being in his state matters. I would think it's unclear so far where Vegas stands on this and where the casinos and everything stand on this. In terms of, the major players when it comes to Congress too, though, are going to be the leagues. I'm skeptical that we're ever going to reach a point where daily fantasy sports is defined as illegal gambling in federal law because the leagues are so invested in this. The NFL and Major League Baseball and the NBA and their teams, the NHL too, all want this. They're all already a party to all of this. And though they maintain it's not gambling, that's raised cries of hypocrisy all over the place. But I think that their desire to see this maintained matters, especially when it comes to Congress. Now, at the state level, it's different because states obviously have their own gambling laws as far as they fit into the federal landscape. And we already have a lot of states taking looks at it. Massachusetts, which is where I believe I get them mixed up all the time. One of FanDuel or DraftKings is based in Boston. Massachusetts is taking a look at this. California is. Nevada is. Now we have a grand jury potentially looking into it in Florida over this latest scandal. So there's a lot of state action on this front. But I think it's hard to tell what's going to happen in terms of like regulation, anything like that, because it's Congress, right? Like they're not getting anything done at this point. And aside from that, it's hard to know right now what needs to be done or what would be done. I think there's a chance that the companies, from people I've talked to, there's a chance that the companies could say that this is a good thing and they would open up and say we need some regulation. But other people say, there's no way. They don't want regulation in here. It's kind of, the devil you don't know is worse than the one you do. And if they can figure out how to regulate themselves, if they can bring some best practices in and sort of get their houses in order, then they might be able to do that, especially, if Congress can't get it together and actually do anything about it. But I do think it's interesting. I think this scandal probably provided more impetus for Congress actually taking a look at this. I think it was growing to the point where obviously Representative Pallone and others had kind of mentioned it. But I think this scandal kind of blew the doors off and kind of gave enough momentum to all of the questions around the industry that we will actually get some sort of hearing and some sort of potential inquiry into this from Congress. And like I said, the action at the state level is going to keep going as well.
Right. It's interesting to me, you said it's unclear where the casino industry, I guess, stands on increasing regulation on daily fantasy and maybe trying to get it put in the same category as online gambling, because it's my understanding that the casino industry was one of the major backers of people in Congress who did want to restrict online gambling, who did want to outlaw or online poker, let's say. And so it seems strange that they might be sitting on the sidelines right now. And maybe this is just the cynic in me, but you had a piece on Congress and congressional regulation at the Huffington Post, and Harry Reid seemed to be one of the people with some of the strongest rhetoric against the spread of daily fantasy. And, just on the follow the money level, Harry Reid does get a lot of money from casinos. And that's not to say that they give him marching orders or anything, but usually, he's kind of a supporter of the gambling industry, at least in Nevada, as opposed to having it spread across the country. So it seems strange, I guess, that they would sit on the sidelines here. On the other hand, because like you said, some of the leagues themselves are so in bed with the daily fantasy industry already, and they might be people who would trot up to Capitol Hill in support of keeping it in the same legal gray area that it currently is. Seems like a pretty steep hill to climb for people who might want to see it regulated in the same way that online poker and online gambling are regulated?
Well, I think you have to put all of this into context too, which is that the atmosphere around legalized sports gambling itself is sort of changing. Not only do you have the New Jersey case that I mentioned, but you have Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, has called for legalized sports gambling. He wants it done on the federal level, not state by state. So that's the reason they're still fighting the New Jersey case. But and Rob Manfred, the commissioner of Major League Baseball, has said that gambling is an issue they could reconsider in the future, in the near future too. So I think in terms of where all of this fits, where does it fit in Congress? Where does it fit in the states? Where does it fit to the leagues and to the public consciousness? It all is kind of in that context. Whether you consider it gambling, whether you don't, we're in kind of a shifting of the norms as it comes to gambling. I think it's still possible, even, no matter all these changes, no matter the opposition from the leagues, whatever, I think it's possible that Congress could step in with regulations. I think it's from people that I've talked to about it, there's certainly areas where they could help bring transparency and other things to the industry. But again, the question is, by the time there's even hearings or by the time there's any action in Congress, what will these companies have done to do that on their own? And that's really the real question I think right now. And again, from people that I've talked to about it is, are the companies going to take different steps, take drastic steps to increase transparency, to convince people that these consumer protections are there, that there aren't employees and other people accessing information that in a way that kind of tilts these games one way or the other. A lot of what happens in Congress or what happens elsewhere depends on their continued actions on this front. And some of it too, some of their actions depend on how people react to this. If they lose users, if there are a rash of people who stop doing this because they see it as tainted, because they see it as them not having a level advantage in these games or a level playing field in these games, that could be problematic. I mean, a lot of what these companies are doing as a growth strategy is still contingent on adding to their user base. And so I think if something changes there, we could see even bigger changes from within as opposed to needing outside regulation. But, in terms of that, like I said before, I think it's a virtual certainty at this point that Congress at least holds hearings on it. And who knows what will actually come out of that. We've all been to hearings, particularly as they pertain to sports, where Congress strikes a strong tone and asks good questions, bad questions, neutral questions, and then never really revisits it. So it kind of depends on if everything stops at a hearing or if it goes beyond that.
All right. So we will keep an eye out for committee hearings maybe in the coming months. That's about all the time we have for today. Thanks a lot for joining me, Travis.
Thank you.
And I will see everyone next time on Blogging Heads.